Hello, I'm Adam Pacitti from Cultaholic Wrestling, and you are watching Tom Talks Rubbish. It's the place for interviews, wrestling reviews, and so much more.
What's going on, guys? It is your boy, Tom Talks Rubbish, and today I am joined for another interview with Jacob from the, is it My Social Life podcast? I always feel like I say it wrong, and I do apologize.
No, you nailed it, man. My Social Life is the name of the show. You got it.
Wow. So my first question for you is, what is My Social Life?
Yeah. So My Social Life is a podcast that I started 3 years ago. Actually, I think the first episode, believe it or not, came out 3 years ago to this exact date. I believe it was July 28th was the first episode that came out.
This will be the date that we're recording it. It's not the date that it'll go up. Just to
correct.
clarify.
Correct. Yes. Good point. And so My Social Life is a podcast, which is all about telling the life stories behind the people that you see on social media, hence the name My Social Life. So it's a combination of a little bit of a play on words, also about social media and the lies behind the people.
I get you.
Yeah. So I like to dig into the stories and go back to the beginning, talk about people's childhoods when they first started creating content or got into their career that they're doing, kind of how they got to where they are today.
That's cool. So a question that I had scheduled for later, but it's just the way the conversation's flowed, is what do you think makes My Social Life different from other podcasts out there?
If I had to pick something, it would probably be the amount of research that I do. That is probably my biggest distinguishing factor when it comes to my podcast. I will spend hours researching each and every guest that comes on the show. And that's how I try to separate myself, by just knowing little things that other people don't know. And because I try to tell someone's story from beginning to end, I go and I listen to as much as I possibly can. And so people will mention things in one podcast, but forget to mention it in another. So I try and find out as much as I can about a person so that when we do sit down and do my podcast, we're covering everything in their story that they might have mentioned in one podcast, but not another. So I try to make it the most complete telling of a person's story. And I do that with the research.
So basically what you're saying is, I don't know if you're familiar, you'll probably be familiar with who I'm talking about, but you may not be familiar with the show. You're very similar to Piers Morgan's life stories.
Okay, interesting. I'm familiar with Piers Morgan, but I've never watched his show.
It's like basically what he'll do is something very similar to what you do, which is he'll have a celebrity on, like, I know he's not alive anymore, but it's the first name that pops into my head, Michael Jackson. And he'll talk about from his childhood to what would be present day. Is that similar to what you do?
Pretty much. Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. So yeah, it's all the whole telling of the story. So I go right from, like, my first question is almost always like, what were you like as a kid? Or tell me about growing up in X, wherever they grew up. And we end usually around where they are today. And maybe we'll dive a little bit into their expertise at the back end. But for the most part, yeah, we talk about right from childhood to today.
That is really cool, man. So I don't want to dig too much into your childhood unless you're comfortable talking about it.
I'm pretty open, man, so you're good.
But where did your love for broadcasting or interviewing come from?
From doing this podcast. Like, I had no idea that I wanted to interview people. That wasn't something that was on my radar. So when I started the podcast, like, I was doing social media stuff, like had a YouTube channel and things like that. And the intent behind the podcast was going to be, let me learn how these other people who have grown on YouTube, how they've grown their YouTube. And so I'll interview them about it. And then I'll just take everything I learn and do it to my YouTube channel. So it's a very selfish thing in trying to learn from these people. And the podcast gave me that excuse to talk to them that I wouldn't have.
Sorry, man. No. I was going to say, I think I was very similar in that regard.
Yeah. And so it started just by doing these interviews about social media with people. And then ultimately it started up taking more time than my YouTube channel because I was doing so much research in advance that the podcast was just taking more and more time. But I realized I had a knack for it. And I had a knack for the research and finding those little things that most people wouldn't expect me to know. And it became almost every single episode, someone would ask me, like, how did you find that? Or how did you know that? Or people would, like, early on, people started complimenting my voice when I did podcasts. And like, just people from talking to people, I got more people pointing things out about my interview style or anything about my podcast that I wasn't getting elsewhere. So people started to point out that I had a knack for doing interviews. And so I just stuck with it. So it's not like there was a natural want to do interviews. It just kind of happened over time. Like, it wasn't my passion when I was 5 years old. And I subscribe to the belief that you're never just going to find your passion. Your passion comes with hard work. And as you become better and better at something, that's when passion comes, when you start to master that craft. I by no means mastered interviewing. I have a long way to go. But yeah, so it started honestly when I was like, I started the podcast at 21 years old. So that's when I would have really started falling in love with interviewing.
How old are you now, out of
I'm
curiosity?
23.
Oh, you're only a year older than me then.
Yeah, so you're in 99, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So my birthday's in a month. So I'll be 24 in about
Are
a
you
month.
97 then,
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Okay. So if you weren't passionate about interviewing, was there a specific interviewer 5 years ago that's gave you the idea and was like, oh, I could do this?
No, so there's never anyone that made me realize I could do it. I just have always done something in terms of content. Like since I graduated high school, like it was a couple different YouTube channels. Like I had a sports show where I did some stuff, but it was never interviewing. And there was never anyone specifically where I was like, oh, this person makes me want to interview. I had a heavy podcast phase, probably the year up to me starting my own, which is probably why I started, because I was just listening to so many different ones. But even when doing my show, I was never like, okay, I want to emulate this person or I want to be like this person. It was very much like, it probably happened subconsciously where I realized that my interview style is probably a combination of like Tim Ferriss and who hosts the Tim Ferriss show, Guy Raz, who hosts the show How I Built This, because those are probably the two podcasts I listen to the most before starting my show. So it's probably just a bunch of subconscious influences. I'm sure Sean Evans is in there a little bit because I listen to Hot Ones. And so it's just a subconscious mix more than a conscious.
I got into Hot Ones during the pandemic, by the way.
Oh yeah, you a fan of the show?
I got it. It was a complete accident. I was Googling, are you a wrestling fan, out of curiosity?
So not current, like I wouldn't describe myself as a fan. Growing up, I was definitely a fan. But just as I've grown, I feel like I go in spurts or phases of wrestling where I'll be like super into it for like a 2, 3, 4 weeks, but then I'll fall off. But I feel like I'm very like I hyper fixate. So I'll fall back in love with wrestling every once in a while and I'll watch a bunch of stuff, but I'm not like actively watching every week or anything.
Fair enough. The only reason I asked was going back to my Sean Evans and Hot Ones thing is because I was Googling Chris Jericho to look for something to do for my YouTube channel. And I saw that he'd been on Hot Ones. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, 100%. That definitely makes sense. And Chris Jericho's it's interesting that he took the jump to AEW, and I think he's Canadian as well. So I'm Canadian, so I'm definitely familiar with Chris Jericho for sure. I'll know probably most of the names of wrestlers if you throw them at me, but like I couldn't tell you what happened on Raw this week for context.
To be honest, I consider myself a wrestling fan, and I couldn't tell you what happened in WWE anymore.
Fair enough.
So if we were to take this back, what was the first interview you did? As I say, I probably should know this, but because we only planned this a few days ago, the research I didn't have as much time as I would like to do research, and I apologize for that.
Dude, no, you do not have to apologize. Trust me, I understand life gets in the way. And like I have like an automatic calendar when I book interviews, and I have it so you can't book it 2 days away. So I appreciate you for taking this on such short notice. So I have respect for you for doing that, even without doing the research.
It was like, because should we tell the story of how this got set up?
Sure, man. By all means, you take it away. You can tell the story.
I saw your interview with the great man that is Chris Van Vliet. And did I tweet it out just saying that I really enjoyed it?
You did, yeah.
And you sent me a DM that night, didn't you?
Mm-hmm.
Or whatever time that would be in Canada. Like,
yeah,
I'm not very good with time zones, my friend. I apologize.
That's okay. I have a bit of an understanding because for context for you, I have a bunch of family in Leeds, so I've been over to England about 6 times.
Really?
Yeah, so I know England is 5 hours ahead of me, and then I grew up in a different time zone from where I'm living right now. So I know. So I've always had a relative understanding of time zones just from traveling and growing up in different time zones. Where other family is. Yeah.
So it's like when you said, because I think originally you said a Canadian time, and I was like, wait, that's flipping whatever this time is at my time. I can't do that. But anyway, so you sent me a DM being like, thank you for the really nice comments. I hear you're an aspiring interviewer. If you ever want to have a chat, let's make it happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, Yes, please.
Yeah, and I didn't know we were gonna do like this. I'm stoked for recording it, but I just mean like I would be down to just chat with you on the phone. But when you were like, let's record this and turn it into content, I was all about that.
I was like, because for a bit of context, for those that don't know, obviously the COVID-19 pandemic is a thing. And I just got pinged. I don't know if it's similar in Canada, but I've been in contact with someone that's got COVID.
I'm sorry to hear that.
So I'm having to isolate for a week just so I don't spread it to anyone else. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, 100%.
So when you said it, it was like, I need content for my YouTube channel. Like, I feel like, because I love, as an aspiring interviewer, I love picking people's brains about interviewing.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like it'd be selfish to use all your just for myself. Do you know what I mean?
I understand that. I appreciate that, man. I would have been happy to chat with you one-on-one. But like I said, I'm glad we're doing this too. I enjoy interviews and I enjoy being interviewed. So I'm always happy. So I was stoked when you said let's put it on my YouTube. I'm honored that you're willing to turn this chat into an interview for your channel. So appreciate
I was
it.
like, you know what? I need to get to contact with Zoom. This will give me someone else to pick their brain. Like, it's cool. So going back to the research side of it, when you're interviewing, say, a niche person who may not have a Wikipedia page, who may not be widely available if you just Google their name, how do you find stuff about them? Is it just literally a deep dive on their social media?
Deep dive on their social media. I will Google their name and I will Google whatever keywords I need so that they start coming up within Google. And then I usually go through the first 5 pages and I try to read every single result on Google. I'll go through the first 5 pages. I'll listen to interviews they've done. If I can find any podcasts they've done, if they have a YouTube channel, I'll go and watch their YouTube videos. So I try and deep dive not just on their social media, but I try to deep dive everywhere I can and find anything and everything that I can. When that's like my first step. But I do my research in 3 parts, and the first one is diving, just consuming as much as I possibly can about this person.
Mm-hmm. So what is the second and third part then?
So yeah. So second, I guess now that I say that, I'm trying to condense it in 2 parts instead of 3. So phase 1 is all the research and the consumption of content. Phase 2 is then organizing all of that. Because when I'm researching, I just dump it all into a Word doc that ends up being like 5-6 pages long. And then so I'll go through and I will organize all of that research into a chronological order. So how I talked about, I start with them as kids. I will go back and I will organize it all in chronological order from where they're kids to where they are now. And then phase 3 was going through and adding supplementary questions. And I felt like I almost did that as a cushion in case I ran out of questions. But then like my notes were becoming like 10 pages, 3,000 words long. And I was like, that's just unnecessarily long. And we weren't even covering everything I'd have. So now I'm just trying to cut that 3rd phase. So I do it in 2 phases, which saves me probably like 2.5 hours worth of time. And I do this every week. So 2.5 hours over the course of a month adds up, right? So it's just now I do it in those 2 phases where I do all the research and then I organize it into a way that makes sense for how I think the conversation will flow.
So, for example, how long between you asking someone to come on the channel and the interview actually being recorded? How long do you have to do an interview? Research, sorry, not an interview.
Yeah, so it used to take me about 4 days, 3 if I was speedy. Now I can do it in 2 because I'm not doing that 3rd step anymore, and I'm just doing it with those first 2. I can do it in 2 days, depending on. I will actually to the point of you saying if it's a niche person, I can do a niche person in 2 days because there's just not a lot of content about them. But if it's someone who has a bunch of content, usually 3 days because it's going to take me 2 days to do all that research just because there's going to be so much of it to consume.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll say 2 to 3 days is how much time it takes me to do that.
Is that why you won't do what I've done, which is interview someone within like a day?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty tight turnaround for me. I try to keep them at least a week ahead just because I'm doing it every week. So it's like I can't book last minute because if I have interviews this week, I'm already prepping for that interview. So I can't drop 2 in. I am right now because I'm going on holiday next week. So I got to get some buffer.
Oh, very nice.
I've recorded 4 this week. So I got 2 left and I've recorded 2 already.
So I appreciate, because you're a busy man this week, I appreciate you taking the time to do this then.
No worries, man. I was excited to do this.
So, like, if you, what's it called? We've talked about the research and stuff, but have you ever had to, like, with booking a guest, how do you go about doing that? Because I'm just starting out and building my portfolio. Portfolio, is that the right word?
Portfolio, catalog. I think it works. I think so.
You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
because I'm building my list of guests, let's put it that way. Do you have like a booking agent, or do you just literally like send out a tweet or a DM and I'm like, would you want to come on my show? Because
Yeah,
that
man.
is what I'm at the minute.
That's literally it. I do this entire thing by myself. So yeah, I am just sliding into DMs, sending emails, and just asking people to come on my podcast. I've started sending video messages to see if that personal touch increases the acceptance rate of people coming on the podcast. But yeah, it's literally just finding people I think are interesting on the internet, finding a way to contact them, and hoping they see my message and hoping they answer me. And so it's literally just shooting my shot everywhere I can.
Mm. Well, you've got lucky so far from the ones that I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, like I've gotten quite, I mean, but believe it or not, there are way more no's and people that have just never answered me than I've had on my podcast. So I've done 149 interviews. So we'll say for every person that comes on my podcast, there's at least 2 to 3 people that don't answer. So I've
Mm.
sent a lot of DMs and emails in the last few years. That's for sure.
I think that's mainly the reason I started by interviewing my friends.
Hmm. That's a good way. It's a good
Because
low pressure way to start too, right?
because not just that, Jacob, but also I knew, and it's not just about me, so I don't want to keep talking about myself.
No
But
worries.
say I knew, for example, if I'm a novice interviewer, I'm not going to have access to The Rock. I'm not going to have access to Chris Van Vliet or John Cena or I'm trying to think of a non-wrestling person that won't pop into my head. Tom Hanks or someone. But what do I have access to? My friends.
Hmm. And not only that, but I would encourage you to try and take some of those bigger swings because you never ever know who's going to say yes, right? And so by not sending that message, I mean, like, granted, you can send a message to The Rock, odds of him replying are low, and I understand that, but you never ever know who's going to say yes. So the worst thing that happens with you sending someone a message is they say
Is
no.
you don't
And
get a reply or they don't.
yeah, and you're literally in the exact same situation you were before you sent the message, right? So the only change that's going to happen with you sending that message is them coming on your show. And that's what I try to tell myself, right? Like if I send them the message and they say no, I don't have them on my podcast. If I don't send a message, I don't have them on my podcast. But if I send a message and they say yes, now I have them on my podcast.
Okay, with that then, what do you get more nervous for? Is it having the interview or sending that message?
What do I get more
To
nervous for?
yeah, is it to trying to set up the interview or the actual interview itself?
I think it's probably the interview. I mean, like, I don't really get too nervous before. I mean, I've done quite a few now where it's just like I don't get too nervous when I do the interviews. And I also, because I've done so much research, I feel like I know that person already when I sit down. So, I mean, there's not a ton of nerves. If I had to pick one, I'll say it's the interview. That's probably actually, you know think of what I'm most nervous about is making sure my connection stays good during the interview and I don't want anything
Yeah,
dropping off. That's what I am most nervous about of anything.
I'm I'm not gonna lie, mate. My internet connection is the drizzling poo. So I have been terrified and crossing my fingers the entire time we've been doing this that it's not gonna go.
See, you don't have to worry though, because I, as the person on the other side, I understand that stress. So if it does go, you have nothing to worry about. I will be okay because I can relate more than you know.
Yeah. So So what do you feel like when plotting out your interviews? Do you also plot out questions?
Yes, I used to. I used to plot them out excessively, like to the point where
Mhm.
I would have 8, 9, 10 pages of questions every interview. But that just took me so long to do that I scaled that back. And so now I'll add questions if I think it's a question I really want to ask. But now I just more so have like my outline of this person's life and things they've done and topics that I want to cover. But now I'm starting to trust myself more to be able to carry the interview without the questions. But for 145 interviews, I had all my most of my questions written out. But when I sat down to do the interview,
Because it's like for me, I'd say this is a downside maybe. interviewing my friends and people that aren't in the public eye means they ask for questions in advance half of the time because they want to rehearse because they're not used to being on camera. Do you know what I mean?
100%. So what I'll do in that context is I will send them an outline. I won't send them my questions. I will send them topics of where this is how I think the conversation is going to flow. And like I have to do that.
Oh, that's so much better.
Because then
I might steal that idea, man. I'm sorry, but
no, do it, man, please. And because now they know what we're going to talk about. They're comfortable with what's going to happen in the interview, but they don't know every single question. So you're going to get that organic, that authentic answer. And the other thing too that you'll get with that is that, I mean, I find, because I try to find little things people won't expect me to know on the podcast. And so if I gave them all my questions, they're going to know everything I have. So I still want those surprise moments when I ask you something about your childhood that you won't expect me to know. So I just send a general outline of what we'll talk about.
So I want to talk about interviewers in general now. What are some qualities you feel like make a good interviewer and a bad interviewer?
I don't know about bad interviewer, but I'll say good interview. It's listening, right? So it's not just like part of the thing is no, if you have a list of questions, I think that's okay. Cause again, I pretty much always operate with a full list of questions, but it's not being religious about those questions. If the conversation takes a turn, be comfortable going down that turn. You know what I mean? Like, I guess that's an example of a bad interviewer is when it's like, if you're not listening and you're just focused on what do I have written down, which like you've been good. Like we right off the hop after my first answer, you were like, I had this later, but we're going to talk about it now. Like that's perfect. Like to be able to roll with the conversation and make it flow more naturally, which is what you did right from the beginning of this interview. That's a big one, is being able to listen and being comfortable to go where the conversation is, but also being able to make sure it doesn't go too far off track.
So talking about going off track, have you ever had an interview that's like, this person doesn't like me, or this interview has gone right off track? And how would you get them back on track?
Yeah, I think for me, like that's a good question because I feel like I'm pretty good, not just kind of to my own horn, but at keeping it relatively on track. I've had a couple where they've gone off the rails. Like there was one, I'm obviously not gonna say the name, but it was like almost a 2-hour podcast. And I like remember finishing recording that and I was like, what just happened? And so I don't honestly know how to kind of like, it's just at that point, I think if it's going off track, that's where yes, still listen, but don't be afraid to ask an unrelated question to try and get things back on track. You don't have to necessarily keep going down that road with the guest who's running off the rails. So don't be afraid to ask a question that kind of brings it back to where you kind of want that conversation to go.
Yeah. A question that I'm really curious to know, because I did an interview recently, I don't know if you saw it, with Adam Pacitti from Cultaholic.
From Cult, that's not What Culture, is it?
No, that's like the guys that originally ran, the original presenters of What Culture Wrestling.
Yeah.
They basically decided, we don't like how What Culture is run, we're going to go off on our own.
Okay, interesting. Because I have watched What Culture Wrestling. Like whenever I've been in those, like they do top 10 lists and stuff. And so whenever I'm in like a wrestling mood, I'll watch some of their videos and stuff like that.
Well, I had him on the channel recently. That was a dream interview that I got to tick off, by the way, because he DM'd me and I don't know how he saw. Basically, the story is I put up a list of my dream interviews, and I'm guessing he saw it somehow because he DM'd me and was like, do you want to do it tonight?
There you go. Who else is on that list?
A man that you've interviewed, Chris Van Vliet.
Okay.
Like, I think he is the absolute GOAT of an interviewer. And I'd put you up there, if I'm honest, man.
I appreciate that. I still consider myself an aspiring interviewer, but that means a lot. Thank you.
So I'd love to just, even if we were going to do what we were going to originally do, which is not record it, but just pick his brain. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I hear you.
So yeah, a lot of mine are like niche ones that you may not know. They're wrestling related.
Okay. Try me. Let's see if I can get any of them. I'm curious.
Obviously The Rock.
Yeah.
Simon Miller.
Nope, I don't got that one.
He works for What Culture, so he's one that I'd love to tick off.
Yeah.
The one that I did manage to tick off was Anthony from the Anthony podcast, which was so cool.
That's awesome. I don't know the Anthony podcast, but it's cool. It's cool when you have someone that you want to interview that you get to check off that list, you know?
Because funny story with that one. Anthony's also got cerebral palsy like myself. I don't know if you can see, but I'm in a wheelchair.
Okay.
And he basically became like a YouTube friend almost.
Yeah.
And had me on his show. And I had a moment of like, what is happening? Have you had that moment yet? Like, how did I get here?
Yeah, I have. And it was the first year I did my podcast is where that moment really happened. So when I decided when I started the podcast, because like most shows fail, I think it's like after 7 episodes or something like that.
It's something like that.
Yeah. And so I told myself once I hit 15, which is more than double what most people fail at, I will allow myself to book a trip and go to New York City and record podcasts in New York. Because I wasn't doing remote interviews at the time. I was doing only in person at the beginning. And so I was like, I'll go to New York and I'll record interviews. And so in 6 days, I recorded 10 interviews up and down Manhattan. And I brought a buddy of mine.
No, that sounds tiring.
It was honestly so much fun though. And like, I was just like, after every podcast, I had like energy. Like I always get a post podcast rush whenever I finish. Like I just like floating after. Exactly. You understand. Yeah.
You get a post upload rush as well. Cause I do.
I don't, because I scheduled so far in advance, and then I'll just wake up on a Monday morning with an email that's been like, "Hey, your episode's out now." And I'm like, "Okay, cool." So because I scheduled them so far in advance, I don't have that. I never hit publish.
This is something that I need to learn to do a bit more, because like we're recording this on just to peel the curtain back a little bit. I've been in isolation for so many days. I'm not too sure what day it is. It's Wednesday, right?
Correct. Yeah, the 28th.
We're recording this on the Wednesday, and I upload on a Monday.
Okay.
So this will go up on the Monday, and that Monday night I will be obsessively looking at what the views are.
You got it.
Which is not healthy.
It's not. And I actually was journaling about this literally yesterday, and I was thinking about it. I was like, when I'm the happiest with my podcast is during and after interviews, like right when I finish interviews. When I'm the least happy with my podcast is when I just sit there and I look at how many views or subscribers my show has. You know what I mean? So it's just like, it was just an interesting point. It's just like, it's not good for you to count the views, right? It's to focus on what you can control, and you can control the views to an extent, but you can control your interview more.
Yeah. So going back to obviously interviewing famous people. And the original question that I was going to ask before we went on a little bit of a tangent, which is good at the end of the day, how do you deal with like being starstruck? That is hard to say.
I don't know if this is going to sound arrogant or not, but I find I don't really get starstruck anymore. Granted, I'm not interviewing like the upper echelon of celebrities. I'm not at that point, but after doing so many, it's just, I realize I've learned that people are just people at the end of the day. And so there isn't that starstruck moment. Like I've interviewed people like the co-founder of Starbucks. I've interviewed just so many different.
I saw that one. I did get a chance to watch that one. That's a great one, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah. So, but it's like, I'm chatting with him, and like, I realize as I'm talking, I'm like, this is just a guy, you know what I mean? Like, we both wake up in the morning. We both like, there's that saying was that we both put our pants on the same way, one leg after the other. And like, it's just people at the end of the day. And so that coupled with doing so much research that I feel like I know them already, like I don't really have I don't get starstruck anymore, really, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I understand. But one little bit of research I did manage to do was you have a marketing company, correct?
I do, yeah.
So what are do you want to talk about that for a little while?
Sure, man, absolutely.
So is it JAK marketing? I'd never want to pronounce it.
Correct. Yeah. So it's Jack Marketing is how I've just pronounced it. So that's just my initials, marketing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So what sort of work does your company do then?
Yeah. So, I mean, right now we're a boutique agency. We service clients across North America and in parts of Europe. By parts of Europe right now, it's just Vienna, Austria. I work with a company out in Vienna. And I work with some clients on both the West Coast and the East Coast of North America. specializing mainly in social media marketing and management, organic stuff. So like managing your Instagram, LinkedIn. I also, with just my experience podcasting, like I do some podcast editing for different clients as well. And so it's a lot of social media stuff and then podcasting when it comes up.
That leads me nicely to my next question, actually. What are some similarities that you think you can take from marketing and put them into podcasting and vice versa?
I mean, I think for me, that's a good question. And I'm trying to figure out the best way to answer that. I think in the beginning it was messaging, just trying to cold pitch people and cold message people. Like I had so much experience just emailing people out of the blue for my podcast that like when I was doing that for business, it wasn't a scary thing to do. So that benefited. Yeah.
Sorry. Was your company established after your podcast then?
Correct. Yeah. So my company was, I just established in January of 2020 and the podcast was July of 2018.
Tom, this is where you need to learn to do your research.
That's okay. Hey, we took this on a super last minute. So don't stress about that. And I'm not like it's in my bio where you would have seen that I have the company, but like I think I've only posted like twice about my agency. So it's not something I talk about.
I don't know, like because I got so used to interviewing my friends, I don't know, like didn't have to do the research. And because we were mainly focusing on topics, we were only talking about one specific topic. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I understand.
Now I've branched out and I'm interviewing more semi-famous people like yourself and other people.
I would not describe myself as semi-famous, but that means a lot. I appreciate that.
But do you know what I mean? I need to get into the habit of not taking an interview the day someone offers it and doing my research.
As long as that's what works best for you, right? Like it comes down to your personality. Like I feel like in order to conduct a good interview, I feel like I have to do the research, but I have a buddy who has a podcast. And if you made him do the amount of research that I did, it would totally ruin his interview style. He's way better sitting down, knowing almost nothing about you and uncovering that through curiosity in the interview and doing no prep than how I do. We're completely different in our interview styles, but we both conduct good interviews. So it all comes down to your personality and how you feel comfortable doing it.
That leads me to my next question then. Do you think you can conduct a good interview without doing any research?
Totally. 100%. It just comes down to being curious. I think, yeah, short answer is yes. It comes down to just curiosity. I just think with my personality, I'm better suited doing it with the research.
I think I'm somewhere in the middle, like not doing so much of a deep dive like you do, but not doing absolutely none. Does that make sense?
No, that makes sense.
I need to know something about that person just to have topics of conversation to talk about.
Of course,
if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and I think most people are where you're at, where they're at that middle ground. But I know I've had John Lee Dumas on my show, who hosts the podcast Entrepreneurs on Fire, which is I think they do like millions of downloads a month. But he was saying that all he does is he will sit down right before the interview. He'll read like the about section on your website. It's like those 2 paragraphs, and that's all he wants to know. And they sit down and do the interview that way. And that's all he comes in.
Yeah, that might be what I end up doing, if I'm honest.
Yeah, you just have that little bit of context, so you know a little bit about that person, and then you're good to go from there.
So with interviewing, like, what do you feel like are some overused questions?
I've never had anybody not that question. I will say that no one has ever asked me that. I've never asked anybody that. I think it's a hard question to answer because I don't listen to, like, I do listen to a ton of interviews, but it's like whenever I listen to an interviewer, I'm never listening to the interviewer. I don't study interviewers as much as I should. I listen to the guest a lot, but I think like, I don't know how to answer that question. There's no actual question that comes to mind. I think it also, overused questions depends on the guest as well, right? Like that's where I also find the research is beneficial. Is like I want to make sure there's going to be some repeat stuff that they've talked about in other interviews, just with the nature that how I do it. But I don't want my interviews to be asking all questions they've gotten before, right? So
that was going to be my next thing, actually, saying like you don't want to almost be like, when I had Adam on, I didn't want to just discuss his what culture stuff because I feel like anyone that knows him would know. Does that make sense? So we did. So we covered it. Don't get me wrong, but we didn't. You know.
Yeah, it wasn't the whole interview. You know, it was part of the interview.
Exactly. It's been a long day. It's late over here in England, man.
I know, and I appreciate that as well. It's 8:30 right there, right?
8:45, but
8:45. Yeah, so I'm about 5 hours behind you. So about 3, about 3:45 here.
very nice. So yeah. No, we covered this. We covered this. For young interviewers, what would you say is the biggest mistake they make?
I think it'll go back to not reaching out to people that they think they can get on the show. You know what I mean? I think that's a big mistake that I took in the beginning is like, oh, I'm not big enough to get this person, or well, I can't message them yet. I'll wait till I have this many downloads, or I'll wait till I interview this person and then ask that person, and like just message them. You never know who's going to say yes, and a no doesn't mean no forever. It means no for right now. So even
Yeah.
if someone does say no, that doesn't mean you can't get them on the show later. So don't be afraid to message some of those people you want to have on your show. Because like I said, you'll never ever know who's going to say yes and who's going to come on your podcast.
So when it comes to your interview style, you say you do a ton of research, but have you ever had a interview come up where you're like, I don't need to research this person. I know everything about them, like because you're a fan or because you know them personally or
Never.
something like that. I don't know if that question makes any sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. I've never ever done an interview with no research. Always, every single time I've interviewed my friends, I've done research on my friends. I found stories about my friends that they don't normally talk about. Always, every single interview, I do research at least. Yeah, no matter what, always the same. No matter who I'm having on, the prep process, the approach to the interview, everything is the same.
So if we were to break down how you do your interview, you DM the person or email or however you communicate, correct?
Yes, sir.
Then you will like deep dive into research for a couple of days and then you'll record the interview. What about post the interview? What do you do? Like,
yeah,
once you turn off the recording, is that it? You literally say goodbye to that person and that's it?
No. So what I do with every single guest that I have on my show is I let them know before we record that I'm going to send you the interview before it goes live. So you have a chance to listen back to it. And if there's anything you're not comfortable going out publicly, just let me know and I'll take it out. No questions asked. You have final edit. This
is why I need to learn editing.
Fair enough. And so why I do that is one, mainly is because it makes them more comfortable on the podcast, that they know that they can kind of maybe go places they're not normally comfortable going. Because if they decide they don't want that going out, it's not actually going to end up going out. And also two, it gives them the air cover to talk longer. Sometimes people feel like they have to really kind of dial in their answers and get them super quickly. But knowing that it's going to be edited, knowing that we can take it out after, it gives them the ability to kind of ramble on if they want to. And usually when people ramble on and talk longer than they normally do is where you get into the good stuff, some of the stuff they don't normally talk about in interviews.
And the stuff that they feel the most comfortable. The more they can ramble, to me, it'd be the more they feel comfortable. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So how much editing do you have to do?
So much.
Oh, really?
Quite a bit, yeah, because all of my interviews are usually around the 90-minute mark. I'm trying to find creative ways to kind of condense my editing time. I listen to my interviews at 2x speed. I'm just trying different ways to reduce that. So I edit the whole interview. I add a template on top of my interview that says my guest's name and my name. I edit the YouTube thumbnail. I edit the cover art for the episode. And then I have to post it on YouTube. I do my keyword research so I can tag all my videos properly. And then I post, and then I schedule the podcast, so just the audio version. So that goes out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all those places. And then I record a second podcast that I call Takeaways, where I basically my thoughts about my own interview. And I
review your interviews, correct?
Essentially. So I'll say like some of the things that I found most interesting or like lessons I learned from my guests I share with my audience. So I record that one, I edit that one, I schedule that one. It's audio exclusive. So that one goes on podcast platforms. Then I go back and I cut 2 10 to 15 minute YouTube clips that I then schedule onto YouTube, and that requires more thumbnails, more keyword research. And then I'll also cut usually 2 TikTok videos as well, and I subtitle those. So that's all of the
Randomly,
research.
your
Yeah.
small interviews, your small one was how I found you.
Yeah, because Chris shared it, I believe.
He did. He put, was it the Smell the Roses clip?
Probably. That was the first one I posted, was the Smell the Roses clip. Yeah.
That came up, and obviously I follow Chris on Twitter, and now I follow your good self. And it was like, you know what, I've got to watch this full interview. More because I like Chris, but because he was putting you over, man.
He was very, very generous with his appreciation. It meant a lot to me to hear from someone like Chris. It was really cool to hear that.
So as we wrap this up, because we've been going about an hour, which is what I like to make my interviews, how, I've got to ask, if you're not a wrestling fan, how did you get into Chris's?
How did I find him?
Yeah.
That's a good question. So I have a folder in my Instagram that's just literally people to message for podcasts. And it's anyone that pops up that I find interesting, I save them to this folder. And so when I need guests, I just go back to this folder and I start messaging people until someone says yes. And I had Chris saved in my folder for like 2 years. So I honestly can't remember where or how I found Chris Van Vliet. Maybe he might have actually, now that I think about it, if I were to guess. So I had a photography Instagram account for a brief period that I then stopped doing. That's off of Instagram now. But I shot Bound for Glory. Like I took photos at Bound for Glory, Impact's pay-per-view.
What, a ringside photographer?
Correct. Yeah. So I took photos at Bound for Glory in 2017, I believe, because it came to Ottawa where I live, and they did it live here. So I got to shoot it because of the company I worked for at the time.
Was this how the Bobby Lashley thing came out as well?
Correct. Yeah. But I think it was it was a cage match with Bobby Lashley. Yeah. I shot that event.
Yeah. But the bit that I watched on the Chris interview where you said
that's right. Yeah. So they were in town in advance of the pay-per-view doing promo stuff. And so I shot Bobby Lashley because I worked for a football team and a hockey team at the time, like a sports management company. And they were doing some promo stuff with the football team. So I was taking photos of the football players with Bobby Lashley, and Eli Drake was the other wrestler that was there with Bobby. And so I forget where I was going with that. Oh, Chris. So I'm assuming because I was posting a bunch of wrestling photos on this photography account, my Instagram Explore page started recommending me wrestling content. And so I'm assuming I stumbled onto Chris that way somehow, if I were to guess, but I'm not entirely sure exactly where and how I found Chris Van Vliet for the first time.
Okay. So I have 2 final questions.
Yeah.
One that I always end my interview, or one that I want to start ending my interviews with, and one that I'm very scared to ask because I'm not sure I want to know the answer.
Okay.
Where can I improve as an interviewer?
What I will say, and this is something I've had to work on, is those audible, I don't know how to, like, the stock, like almost like the subconscious answers you say when someone finishes a question. It's like for me, when I was doing my early interviews, whenever someone would finish talking, every single time I would say, yeah. Like they'd answer the question, I'd be like, yeah. And then I'd ask my question. Or then, so I was like, oh, I got to stop saying yeah. And so I stopped saying yeah. And then I started saying awesome. And so I think like you're actually pretty good, but I think you had like the same, it's just the same, like little phrase. Ticks might be a good way to explain it. Yeah, that's a good word. But I think you said, you said something along those like, that leads me to my next question, or that's like, yeah, like you always would say that was your stock answer. And like, I do the same thing. Like I try to stop saying words. So if you listen to my interviews, I try to cut them out a lot, but sometimes you hear me go, after every answer. And that's because I'm trying not to say a word, but now my thing is, after every answer. And it's just something I'm still working on. So that'd be my big advice for you. But I think like, man, my biggest advice to you would just be keep doing it. Because there's nothing I'm going to say that's going to make you better. It's how you're going to get better is you're going to just keep doing interviews, and you're going to get better every single time you do it.
I appreciate that. So if you were to rate me on my interview skills at the minute, where would you say I am?
How long have you been doing it for?
9 months.
9 months?
Mm-hmm.
I want to give you a 7.
I'll take that. 7 out of 10.
Take a 7 out of 10. I think it's just, yeah, man, you're still early, right? 9 months. Like I still think I'm early. I'm 3 years in. So you got like, you're just going to keep doing it. You're going to get better every single time. Try and find like every interview, try and think of one thing you want to do better next time. Like don't try and look at an interview and be like, I need to fix this, and this. It's look at an interview and be like, okay, let's fix that next time. And those will compound. And every single time you're going to do one little thing better. And that just over time, it'll just get better and better and better that way. So it's don't overwhelm yourself with trying to change 101 things at once. Cause I used to do that, is pick one thing, focus on that each interview, and then you'll just slowly get better and better and better over time.
Yeah, I appreciate that. But the final question I have then is where, like, this is the question I want to start asking people that I bring on that have big shows or big YouTube channels or etc. Where do you see my social life in 5 years?
Where do I see my social life in 5 years? I don't really know, to be completely honest. Like that's probably something I need to improve on, is I've never ever operated with like a big picture goal. Like where do I want to be in 3, 5, 10 years? I've never thought that way. And it's something I think is important, because if you're not doing it on purpose, then you're doing it by accident.
It's like, oh, sorry, man. I'll give you an example. I want to get my channel to 500 subscribers.
Okay.
I'm only like,
you're close.
7 away.
Yeah, you're close, man. You're going to get that. I would say you'll get that within the next 4 months.
I wanted it by the end of the year, but we'll see.
That's in more than 4 months. So I think you're going to do it. I think for sure.
I hope so. But going back to yourself, where do you see, you struggle to see that maybe?
Yeah, I think I struggle with it because like I never think long term, and I think I need to start thinking long term, because I think it's like, how do you get somewhere if you don't know where you're going, right? I think that's kind of my takeaway. So I need to figure out exactly where it is I want to see the show and make sure I'm working towards that.
Okay. So I want to say thank you for coming on, Jacob. Make sure you guys check out my social life. It's very well worth doing, guys. Amazing interviewer.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate that. I appreciate you for wanting to have me on your show. I'm truly honored. And to anyone listening, before you even think about subscribing to my social life, make sure you subscribe to Tom Talks Rubbish. I highly recommend you subscribe here first before you even think about coming to my social life. Tom, I really appreciate you, man.
Thank you, sir.